Maybe you don't know how to count, and that's why you get travel calls wrong, like that play there. Go ahead and rewind it. Let me know if you thought it was a travel. So I know you know how to count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but maybe you don't know how to count steps properly. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's start off with the rules you need to know for high school and college, because that's the rules most players are gonna be playing by, and go over some misconceptions with that. And then number 2, we're gonna talk about NBA and FIBA, because they have slightly different rules on one specific aspect, which is the zero or gather step, which a lot of people do not understand correctly. Even people that think they get it, they don't. Okay, so the first piece of confusion is when to start counting steps. Now, when you're dribbling the basketball, you do not start counting steps when the ball hits the ground. You don't count it when it leaves your hand. In fact, steps don't even start counting when the ball comes back into your hand. And the reason for this is simple. When I'm dribbling, I can take unlimited steps with a live legal dribble. And according to high school and NCAA rule books, the steps don't count until my hand comes under the ball. I have both hands on the ball, I pin it, I cuff it, something like that, where the basketball cannot be dribbled again legally. Then at that point, so my hand's under the ball here, now my steps start counting. One comment that often comes from this is, well, then yeah, if I have my hand on top of the basketball, I could just palm it and take unlimited steps. And they try to show that as like a way that basically, you know, it's a way of cheating. But the fact of the matter is, if you're palming the basketball, that's considered a gather. Now, could a player maybe get away with sneaking an extra step or 2 in where the rest wouldn't notice it? Maybe. But it's gonna be really hard to do that without it being noticeable. This also means you can't carry the basketball, because if your hand's under the basketball, that will be the start of your steps counting. And if you're palming, it's gonna be obvious after about a step that it's unnaturally hanging in the air. I can't do it because I don't have Giannis size hands. But the point is, yes, it could maybe be taken advantage of for a step, but it's gonna be really hard to get away with much more than that. And I know one comment I've heard from a lot of people is that it's all about the ball spinning in your hand. That really has nothing to do with what the ref's gonna look at. And I've heard this directly from refs. I've personally talked to refs on the NBA level, the NCAA level, FIBA level, and on high school level. I could have that ball spinning in the hand and my hand under it, as you saw there. And there's gonna be times where if I get a good grip on the basketball with my hand without palming it, which you saw I couldn't, that the ball's just not gonna spin for very long. That doesn't mean that my steps start counting, because again, I'm in a legal dribble position. I'm not palming it, my hand's not under it. There's nothing illegal about that. So example, if I dribble, I take a jab, that step there does not count because my hand's not under the ball. Now this hand's under the ball, steps start counting. That brings us to the next point of how we're going to count those steps. Now, when we're talking high school and NCAA, we don't even really want to think about steps, because a lot of people think about steps and that messes them up. So we don't want to think about 1, 2 steps necessarily. In high school, we want to think about the pivot. Now, when I say pivot, I put that in quotations and loosely, because a lot of people think that for it to be pivot that I have to stop or take multiple steps and then now it's a pivot. But actually, by high school rules, whichever foot's on the ground first, no matter if I'm running into a layup, whatever the case may be, they're gonna identify that as the pivot. So if I go into a crossover, hand comes under the ball, now that foot right there is my pivot. If I'm driving to the hoop, I pick it up on this step, that foot's my pivot. And the thing you wanna look for is whichever foot is on the ground when the basketball has been picked up. This is a little bit different than the NBA and FIBA. So if I pick it up and this foot's on the ground, that's a pivot. However, if I pick it up and this foot's barely on the ground, right as this foot's coming down, guess what? That foot back there technically is a pivot. It's usually not gonna get called if it's just on the tiptoes like that. You'll see this on layups a lot. Players will pick up the basketball for their first step here, and this back foot will be barely on the ground before going up into the layup. Most refs aren't gonna catch or call that, but technically it would be a travel when we're talking about the rules with the pivot, which is the next thing you need to understand, since we're not thinking about steps. On all levels of play, high school, NBA, college, FIBA, you name it, that pivot foot here can be picked up. Obviously, we know that on a layup, right? A lot of people think, okay, yeah, obviously on a layup you get 1, 2 steps. But what a lot of people don't understand is that if I take a jab step and stop here and have a pivot foot, I can still lift that pivot foot first. They don't have to lift at the same time, with one exception we'll get into in a second. But anything I want to do with this foot, I can take a million steps. We all know that. But this foot can legally lift from there first. And what would make it illegal is the pivot returning to the floor before I pass or shoot. So I can go like this, go up for a shot, completely legal. But if I go like this, and then this foot comes back down, then I shoot, nope, that's a travel, pivot foot, return to the floor. So to bring it back to the move I showed you in the beginning, what I did was I had the basketball floating here, and I didn't actually gather till this foot was on the ground. Steps don't count, steps now count. This is my pivot. I jumped back this way, pivot lifted, I jumped up for the layup and got rid of the basketball for that foot, that pivot foot, landed again, legal. Now here's those exceptions to the pivot lifting. That right there, anytime basically I gather the basketball with my feet in the air and then both feet land on the ground, I can pick a pivot foot. I can use this foot as a pivot foot. That's completely legal. Or like we talked about before, gathering into the Euro, again, there's my pivot foot. That's completely fine. But there's a move that's clearly defined in the rules, especially in high school, as the jump stop. I can pick up the basketball on this foot and I can jump and land with both feet at the same time. That is completely legal. However, in that instance, since I gathered here, I've established a pivot, They allow you to land back on that pivot as long as both feet land at the same time. So this would be my step 1. This would be step 2. But in that instance, I don't get a pivot foot and I have to jump into my shot and not have either foot land on the ground again. So I can't take a pivot. I can jump with either foot lifting again. So I could jump like this, or I could jump like this, or I could jump with both feet off the ground at the same time. But I don't get the option for either foot to land back on the ground at all. One other situation you need to understand that is different, this is for high school, college, NBA, FIBA, everything, is if I've caught a pass and I'm gonna get into a dribble or caught a rebound, really doesn't matter. Anytime I'm gonna start a dribble, I now cannot lift my pivot foot in that situation, which I think is kind of silly. I wish the rules were just the same for if you're gonna go up for a shot or pass versus start a dribble. But if I go like this, lift my pivot and barely have it lifted and get that dribble off, technically that's a travel. Now it's a call that doesn't get made a lot. However, refs are starting to crack down on it more. So to make it legal, I would have to dribble the basketball before that pivot foot is lifted. Okay, so NBA FIBA, this is where all the misunderstandings come into play when we're talking zero or gather step. First of all, some people don't know what it is. Some people kind of know what it is, or they know it exists, but they get it all wrong. So if I pick up the basketball in air and this foot lands, that's still step 1 in NBA and FIBA. What a zero step would be is if this foot's on the ground already before I gather, or they'll give it to you if it's same time. That's a zero step though, because they're not counting a step until the ball is gathered. Now it's any new ground contact with the feet counts as a step. So new contact with that foot, that's step 1. Then I get my step 2. And in essence, that makes this the pivot foot, not this step where the foot was on the ground already before I gathered. And along with all the other previous things we talked about apply. So basically, my step wouldn't count till right here, because here I'm floating in a legal dribble position. Now this foot landed. And if I'm floating, the dribble steps don't count. Step doesn't count because the foot was down before I landed on it. I get this step and this step yet to play with. Now within this, there's a lot of specific examples of things that people might look at and they might say, okay, you know, doing this is illegal or isn't, and I got a ton of different specific examples of those on my Instagram. I'll have that pinned to the comments, and also you can check out more examples in this video here.